Welcome to Airway Breathing Conversation, a podcast presented by the anesthesiology residents at the University of Saskatchewan, created to provide individuals of all levels of medical knowledge with anesthesiology-related healthcare information. Join us this week where we continue our conversation with Doctors Jason Brooks and Anne-Marie Friesen, discussing a wide array of topics related to performance, adaptability, and resiliency in medicine. Now, whether you are an anesthesiologist, resident, medical student, or member of the general public, come take a break with our host, Anesthesia PGY3, Dr. Sebastian Turcott, and a multitude of brilliant and insightful guests as we demystify the incredible specialty that is anesthesiology, one episode at a time.
So we've talked a little bit about this has been an amazing conversation, and there's just so much getting thrown at us, and It's amazing. I'm gonna have to listen over to this a few times just to take it all in. So we've talked about a little bit about strategies outside of work to try and help, your stress levels, your resiliency at work, and then we've talked a little bit about how to manage some of those stressful situations and taking a step back. And I guess I wanted to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, and you touched on being resilient doesn't mean going back to the person that you were, but who are you going to become after a stressful encounter? And I was just wondering if you could touch on that a little bit more then.
Yeah.
Like what does resiliency look like?
Yeah, and what does that look like
context?
to set up your, I'm going to become such? Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Well, I think for me, it's more about, okay, what do I do with my experiences, right? So if I had a rough day in the OR, however you would qualify that, there's many different ways I could deal with that. I could get pissed off, come home, beat myself up, watch the Jets game and go to sleep. Or I could come home, be pissed off, but work through the feelings, bring them down to a point where I go, okay, meet how I'm feeling, what actually happened? What would better have looked like? And how could I be better under those circumstances next time? So part of it is, it's not just experience for experience's sake that, shows us these rich insights that allow us to become more resilient. It's what will you do with that experience? So for me, it's about stepping into it, reflecting on it, figuring out the good, the bad, the ugly. Who can help me get better? What behaviors could I employ to ensure that, under similar circumstances, I can perform better or avoid a certain outcome or what have you? So to me, it's as much about that, really delving into the experiences that you have. Secondly, I love the article. This was written in, I think, 1999 by Malcolm Gladwell, the famous author, did books like Tipping Point and Outliers. But this particular article was called The Physical Genius. And he was curious to learn from, super high-level professional. Wayne Gretzky, for example, was someone that he interviewed for this. What is it that allows them to sustain their success? They face all sorts of setbacks. How do they sustain that in light of that? And he thought initially, I'll bet you that the reason they're so successful is they just always think about that positive outcome. They never waver from that. They don't even consider what could go wrong or any of that. And that's what fuels them through. Then he interviewed them and found, in his estimation, that the exact opposite was true. That in fact, the best performers that he interviewed were driven by, and this is very important, every word, I'll qualify it, but were driven by a practical-minded obsession with the possibilities and consequences of failure. And the key phrase there is practical-minded, meaning they recognize it doesn't matter if you're the best hockey player, anesthetist, CEO in the world, you're still human. And if you're not careful, things could come that, kick you in the proverbial crotch that you're going to have to deal with. And it could be, very difficult. So they did two things to help against that reality. One, they scoured themselves and their environments to figure out, in all the small ways, things that they could do to minimize the possibility of making mistakes or errors or setbacks, etc. That's number one. So can we develop better systems? Can I come in 10 minutes earlier, make sure the OR is set up exactly how I want it? If there's new nurses, introduce myself, make sure we're clear. If there's some communication issue, can I rectify that or ask them to talk about it after it? Just the attention to detail stuff, the small things to avoid what someone else has once referred to as death by inches. So I can do that. But secondly, again, being human, you're going to have those moments where it doesn't go well. And it might be no fault of your own, but we're going to feel responsible, guilty, ashamed, whatever. So when those inevitable moments come, can you find yourself a framework to navigate through? And to me, the framework starts first with allowing in what I'm feeling. If you had a bad day in the OR and you feel shitty about that, well, don't deny yourself that. Allow yourself to work through that feelings. I mean, it's like in a weird way, you're grieving the loss of something, the loss of, innocence on a day where things were going well and then they didn't. Now I feel terrible. I feel ashamed. Just be with those feelings for a little bit. The more you try to rush through what you're feeling, you're just going to drive it further deeper and it's going to come out in other ways. So make space for what you're feeling, number one. Number two, if I do a decent job of that, it's like that child analogy where the child's all activated. Well, if I allow the emotions to subside a bit, now the more rational analyses can take place. Okay, now I owe it to myself to figure a way. What, again, the three questions: what went well, what could have been better, and how can I make it better? So I have an obligation professionally and ethically to be better the next time if I can. The third phase of that is to share my experiences with others such that they may learn, such that they may avoid difficult outcomes such as that. And that has a normalizing effect. It helps me to feel less shame. It's just part of what we do. Sometimes it doesn't go well and we share it with people. But secondly, it gives them hope because I'm sure they're struggling with things that they can't release. And all of a sudden, wow, Sebastian, who's 3 years senior to me, says, he had to work through something hard and it's still a work in progress, but it's going to be okay. Maybe I can release from that thing I've been carrying for a year, right? So it helps deter us from that. And if you do those three things, if you feel fully, if you draw the lessons and apply that and share that experience with others, to me, you've earned the right to feel okay moving forward. Now, that does not mean we forget whatever the thing was. And I know many people who, they can be affected by it at various points in their lives. But to allow myself to go forward, having earned the right to establish a bit of forgiveness in myself, makes for a better performer going forward, which reduces the likeliness that could ever happen again. So long-winded answer, but you got to have a framework.
Oh yeah, I don't know about you, but the feel the feelings thing, that is one that I definitely struggle with.
Well, let me ask you this too, because I think maybe another line of taking this would be in, let's say, an acute moment. So everything's going fine, and then boom, you're in the OR and a complication comes up or something, holy crap, now what? So the idea of using the emotions again, to me, becomes important. Because if all of a sudden I'm highly activated, oh my God, this is terrible, cue every fear coming from imposter that your mind can extract in a moment, right? Just a steady stream of this is going terrible and you're terrible. It's going to be tough to think myself better in that situation.
Ooh, yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
So we can do one of two things, use the physiological reset. I mean, just move around, get some air, walk around the hall if you can, take a few deep breaths, anything that can bring down physiological arousal, which could have the effect of bringing down psychological arousal. Mm-hmm. But secondly, just a quick visualization. And that is when you're all caught up in some emotion or some distracting thought that's, intense. If you could just envision, and this is something Dr. Gabor Mate, who's just a brilliant Canadian psychologist, and his areas of expertise are addiction and trauma. And he talks about, paying attention to the tension. And again, it's this idea, when I'm caught up in it, good luck of thinking yourself through. You don't need to. You don't need to do anything. But if you can imagine the energy you're caught up in as though it was sort of centrally located, like a physical point in your body. Maybe there's a freaking ball storm of energy right, between your chest. It's just glowing and activated, like the friggin' sun. He says, if you rather, don't worry about what you're thinking, don't worry about what you're feeling, but if you can focus your attention on that energy source and just with each breath, imagine it de-energizing. You don't have to judge what you're thinking, correct what you're thinking, nothing. In fact, that'll just fuel it because those thoughts and feelings need your attention to survive. Focus on bringing the energy that's overcome you down, and guess what starts to happen? My mind comes down with it. And I think that's useful because I can do that in a moment. I can do that in the OR, when I get caught off guard with something, if I'm oriented to recognize that's what's happening.
That's Yeah, it's such an interesting way of looking at it because, for a long time, especially early on in residency, I'd be caught in a stressful situation,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're trying to think, but then you're like, oh no, this is stressful. I got to stop thinking about this is stressful, and I got to start thinking about what I need to do.
You're
But oh man, this
spiraling.
is stressful, and then you just
Yeah.
you spiral, and then your emotions get revved up instead of revved down. So
Totally.
I think just the idea of actually focusing on it, taking 2 seconds to try and
Mhm.
reduce it, and then you just give your mind a chance to clear.
Yeah.
And I guess that
And I
comes
would
with
say this.
experience and other things too a little bit. But
Well, it comes
Yeah.
with practice is
Yeah.
what it does. I was going to say,
Ah,
and just because
Practice.
it's like, again, this idea that experience in and of itself doesn't do much, what do you do with it? Great. We covered a strategy. Well, your brain, just because it heard words coming from my mouth talking about de-energy, it won't work the next time you're in the OR unless, I've spent 5 minutes the next 5 days envisioning a situation because, every single one of you would have many that you could draw from where, we got activated from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat. Maybe it was some harsh feedback from a staff person or what. I'm sure there's none of that where you are, but, or whatever, right? I mean, I've gone from 0 to 60 and I'm caught up in it. You can draw on any of those experiences you've already had. You could even envision experiences that you might have, whereby I can just practice ahead of time doing that. What would it look like? Find that centralized spot, see it as a ball of light, see it as a fire, with woods and coals, whatever, and just bringing down that energy. I'll tell you a story about that. I'll tell you a couple. So, guy I worked with, surgeon, ENT surgeon, and this is probably, again, 15 years ago. And he was a resident, and he came to work with us because he was struggling with perceived anxiety, some performance anxiety around the possibility of losing an airway, as I'm talking to the airway experts.
Yeah.
I was going to say, that's a relatable feeling.
Yeah. And he said, look, it's not the technical thing. I mean, that for a ear, nose, throat surgeon to perform the surgical procedure of a Craig is not rocket science, but of course it's the way that the moment feels. It's all on you. It's do or die. It's high pressure. That sort of thing. And he said, just the thought of that, like cue all the interference with heightened anxiety and worries, some thoughts, and etc. And he said, I don't want to live that way. So it's not like I'm losing sleep, but it's there. It's in the back of my mind, and I'd like to somehow rectify that.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, the tricky thing is, it could never happen in my career, which is much more likely, or it could happen today, and it's just the reality. I want to be readier for that. So, okay, we started to envision. I said, so let me put you through a torture test. If I was to airdrop you in that situation right now, and we were watching you from afar, tell me everything you'd be picking up on you. And, for all intents, he's describing, everything just short of soiling himself as he stands there, right? Oh my God, heart rate's pounding, flushed, can't even think of what name it is. My name is, what's the first step? So just total chaos and confusion. I said, okay, so for us to, what would you say, accurately prepare you for how to respond to that moment, phase one of our response most likely is going to be that. So when you instantaneously become super heightened and scared and anxious, that's okay. That's phase one. Because why would we say that? Because that is what's going to happen. If phase one was, no, Anne-Marie, when they say to you, we need an emergency, Craig, it's going to feel amazing. You're going to be relaxed. It's going to be like a walk in the park. No, it's not. It's not. If you've done it 50 times, maybe. If you've done it 0 times, it won't. So phase one of our response plan is, I'm going to be scared shitless. Okay, that's just phase one. That then triggers us to what comes next. I said, okay, when you're that jacked up physiologically, psychologically, what's the first thing we need to do? So I need to take care of some of that. I can't think if I'm that activated. So it's like, great. So phase two, what's that? He said, you know what? Might sound funny. He said, I think I want to make contact with the bed. I just think the physical grounding, if you will, like, I might be a little so jacked up, maybe you're wearing your faint, or just to physically ground the bed. He said, then take a couple of breaths. Then he had a particular, reframe word for him. I don't know what it was. I've been here before. I've practiced this in my mind, whatever it was. And then the next thing, the final part of his reset was, and he wanted to be anchored to what the first step in whatever it is to perform an emergency Craig is. It might have been open the package for all I know, but the first step, because as we know, once you get going on the first step, probably, it just carries over after that. So this was the process. Like, okay, phase one, I'm scared shitless, which signals me to do phase two, which is ground the bed, step back, deep breath. I've been here before. And then phase, I forget what number I'm at now, 4 is whatever the first part of the crike is. Open the crike package, and then boom. This is what he would rehearse. Walking to the OR, just get that in his mind.
Yeah.
Night before, thinking of the surgical slate, get that in his mind. That's it. Not spending 8 hours a day doing intensive mental preparation, just keeping it in mind. I shit you not, about 8 months later, he's on a fellowship in the US, and it happened. And he was the main surgeon doing the thing. He said, and like I had rehearsed in my mind however many times, it's like my mind and body just took over. And I followed the thing. He said it wasn't until he was done at whatever point that, the thing is secure that, he looked up and he said, all I could see was just shock and awe amongst everybody else in the OR, at how calm, cool, collected he was, which is hilarious because he wasn't at all.
Yeah, in his mind, he was
prepared
Right.
to be not calm, cool, collected. That was part of the process. And, now he'll never have that fear again.
That's an incredible story.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about these things a lot, theoretically, losing an airway or something. But I guess I just want to touch back. You touched on earlier, taking that time to practice, right? Because if this is the first time that you're in this scenario and you haven't really rehearsed it or practiced it, you're going to be a lot more stressed and a lot more jacked up than otherwise.
For sure.
So would you say that practice, though, like you mentioned, it doesn't have to be, an 8-hour mindfulness session or something like that. No. It can just be little bits here and there whenever you're thinking about it, whenever it just pops into your mind.
Yeah.
Well,
let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Actually, like, if you think of, pick something in the OR, a complication that pops up, a critical critique from a mentor that just spikes you. If I was to say, like, how long does the acute phase of those, disruptions last? It's probably seconds, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about it, like the rehearsal just needs to be that. So you could be sitting down on your comfort of your own living room. And just the way I like to describe it is imagine as if, and I think I used this example earlier, imagine if you are watching that scene unfold. Like that scene has already unfolded and someone recorded it. And like if you're an athlete, we're going to break down your performance. Oh, Anne-Marie, you could have better technique on this powerlift move, etc. Okay, great. Draw the lessons, be better. So much the same way. We're just assessing how you performed. And if I asked you, okay, Sebastian, when you hit peak moment of activation, stress, anxious, whatever, just hit pause. Okay, boom, there it is. So now we step back. We're safe. It's just me and you. And I go, what's happening inside you right now? Oh my God, my mind's everywhere. I'm racing. My heart's pounding.
Yeah.
Like I have a sense. And in that moment, guess what? You're feeling that. You're not actually in the OR and this thing. But I'll tell you what, if you're doing a vivid rehearsal in that way, you're triggering a lot of those thoughts and feelings. And then we just work backwards. Okay, what if I could give you something in that moment that would be helpful? What would it be? If I could just not be so amped up. Okay, so that becomes the first thing we do. How do we bring down the arousal? Do we talk ourselves to better? Nope. Okay. Can I move? Can I shake my hands? Can I yell at the top of my lungs? If that helps me, honestly, if that purges a little bit of that. Quick thing on that. And please don't, now, I'm not advocating people drop F-bombs in the OR, but I'm just saying,
No.
whatever allows me to de-energize, to expand my bandwidth is useful. When I was growing up, one of the most dominant athletes of the day was Tiger Woods. And his father taught him something so important early on. He was a 3-year-old golf star, just a prodigy. But he taught him, golf is a game of emotions. And he said, okay, Tiger, I don't care if you hit a shot that's the best shot you ever hit and you're super excited about it, or the worst shot, which is more like how all mine are, and you're going to be feeling pissed off about it. He said, I'm going to give you 12 physical steps to feel that fully. So if you hit a great shot and you want a Tiger Woods fist pump with joy, at the end of your 12th physical step, we're done with that.
Yeah.
We're letting go of that. Conversely, if you, want to smack your club and yell F-bombs for 12 steps, do it. But at that 13th, we're done with it. And you go, what does it actually allow the universe that it goes away? No, but I've committed to that being the case. Like I'm instructing my mind and my body, okay, now we're done with it. So it gets used to that. I have long since believed, if you watch Tiger Woods back in the day when he was dominating, there was such an aura he had on the final day where everybody else has been playing 3 straight days of pressure-packed golf.
Mm-hmm.
But because he was so good at releasing from emotions,
Mm-hmm.
there was energy that was stored up. He had more to give on Sunday. So in much the same ways we're talking here, I don't need to spend 5 hours doing it. If a situation like, oh, everything's fine, all of a sudden there's a complication because, I don't know, a valve was closed that should have been open, like that whole drama probably lasts less than 1 minute.
Mm-hmm.
So play it through. Pause it when you're at peak frustration or fear or whatever, and then just think, whoa, okay, hang on. What would be better there? And quite literally in your mind, the film projector, the sim center that your mind is, just rewind the scene and see yourself now meeting that energy with, okay, step 1, step back, take a deep breath, look at the algorithm chart on the wall. I don't know what it is, but you would know. And so I rehearsed a better response under those conditions. And just like anything, the more mental repetitions, that starts to become the default response.
Yeah. And then almost the less emotionally draining it becomes a little bit
Absolutely.
too. Yeah.
For 2 reasons, Sebastian. One that's quite obvious, but the second thing is it reduces anticipatory anxiety because now the fear used to be, oh my God, what if this thing happens?
Yep.
Now it becomes, if this happens, then this. I know how to respond.
Yep.
So I'll give you a personal example, and I'm kind of mindful of the time, but we'll keep going until you kick me off. So in my own life, if I, have to give a big talk in front of a big crowd or whatever, I'm human. You get nerves, you get doubts. It's no different than anybody else. And for me, what has helped me tremendously over the years is a lot of the same things we're saying here. I know it's not me who's thinking and feeling those thoughts. It's the part of me that gets fearful and anxious and doubts, and etc. And so when it pops up, I give it what it needs. I can tell you I'm going to be well prepared because that's just the way that I am. So the truth is it's going to be fine. Even if it doesn't feel that way, the second thing I do to help myself is I've convinced myself that as soon as I arrive physically at whatever the thing is, if it's a big convention center, if it's a boardroom or we're meeting with a group of physicians or whatever, I'm good in the room. And that statement means something. It means that's where I shine, but it also means that's where I have the most control. That's where the nerves, that's where the inner critic quiets down. And with 100% accuracy, that has always been the case. And you go, why? Is it something to do with the air exchange from this room to that? No, it's because and only because I've convinced myself I'm good in the room. So my mind knows, and I give it free rein. You want to be nervous? You want to be in the fetal position in your hotel room 10 minutes before that? I've never been that bad. That's fine, because what lies beneath how I'm feeling is the truth. I'm good in the room, so I can trust that.
Oh, there were a lot of things. I'm still I really like that 12 steps to feel emotions, because I think that's something else that well, I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't really taught. And I keep playing I think it's Chris Bumstead that I heard kind of say that, when you numb the bad, you numb the good, and you kind of numb everything. And then I think that ties back to your thing about kind of living with intent. But yeah, that's interesting. And the power of acknowledging things and acknowledging your feelings.
Yep.
Right.
And one thing I've learned from some of the staff in our department too is that it's actually okay to tell yourself that you did a good job on a good day.
Right.
And we don't always allow ourselves that grace either. But again, to a certain extent, you give yourself those 12 steps, you tell yourself you did a good job, and now you can move on to the next case with a bit more confidence, knowing that, Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that what you've revealed there is another reason why imposter is so epidemic. And I'll preface it with, so a colleague of mine, you mentioned, Anne-Marie, that I did another podcast with a couple of British guys.
Yes.
The actual one lives in the US, but he's from Britain originally. And so one of his friends, who's an emerge doc in the UK, he had done a study because he was kind of fascinated by the fact that, you have M&M rounds, obviously, for when things don't go well. And makes a lot of sense that when things don't go well, especially given the outcomes, that we would want to have an opportunity to delve into that, draw the lessons, and make process improvements. And that's great. He says, but what's interesting is in all medical professions, not most, all, if you looked at the numbers, the vast majority of time, things go well. The vast majority of time.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, why are we not studying that? Like, why aren't we learning why things go well? Maybe it's the communication or the teamwork or whatever. So he came up with a rounds that was different than M&M, and he called it A&A, which stood for awesome and amazing rounds.
Nice.
Yeah, the cases that were tougher, but for whatever the reasons, like we made chicken salad out of what could have been chicken shit. Like, the team came to, we got it. And now all of a sudden you go, okay, how is it that, we focus disproportionately on the negative? Because we don't even let in the positive. It's like, if you did 99 things 100 things in a day, and 95 of them were just fine, maybe some of them were super slick, but 5 weren't good. What's the story of the day?
Right.
It's the 5.
Yeah.
And so by the time I'm a med student through residency, if every single day I allow in 5% of the data, that's it. I disregard the 95. Well, that's just what you're supposed to do. There's nothing to see there. But man, needed to be better here. This was terrible there. And it may have been. But every single day, if you got 95% on the test, but treat yourself like you're a failure, well, no wonder I feel like an imposter. No wonder my confidence and sense of trust is not growing. It's staying the same. Yeah, you're denying so much of the data. So to your point, Sebastian, I always ask people, what do you do with your successes or your wins? And people look at me like I'm crazy. They know exactly what they do with the things that don't go well: perseverate, ruminate, beat myself up, fuel the imposter. But the stuff that goes well, we just disregard. Quick story about that. Sorry, too many stories.
I love it.
I'm a football fan, NFL. And in the 1990s, the Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl. And so, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And they did it, and they're being interviewed in the winner's locker room, the champagne's flowing and high-fiving and all the rest. And already they're asking the star quarterback, his name was Troy Aikman. It's like, okay, and Troy, what do you think about next year? What about the possibility of a repeat? And you can tell he's just thinking, like, for God's sakes, can I just take a minute to enjoy this one before I got to put all the pressure on my back to gear up again?
Mm-hmm.
But he was the kind of guy, I guess, that, he took that seriously. And so that next season, there was the weight of the world, and they did feel some of that, and it was distracting. And they didn't have as good of a regular season, but they made the playoffs, got hot at the right time. Lo and behold, they won it again, back-to-back champs. And I'll never forget watching again. It's like deja vu. They were in the locker room again, same scene as the year before. They're interviewing him, only this time he looked like he was the losing quarterback. Like he was just crestfallen. He was low energy, like just drained. And the interviewer even picked up on that and said, Troy, for someone who's just won the Super Bowl, you seem a little low energy. And he just took a deep breath and exhaled. And he said, let me tell you what this year was like for me. He said, when we won in the regular season, I was relieved. And when we lost, I was devastated. So he left no room for anything other than, thank God we didn't F up.
Yep.
That was it. Well, no wonder there's no joy. No wonder you're so exhausted. No wonder there's so much pressure and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there was many moments of success that he totally disregarded and didn't allow in because it was all about binary. Can't mess up. Can't fail. Can't not win again. And so I think that's a similar analogy perhaps to what you were saying, Sebastian.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just to pick up on that a little bit, I'm a huge sports fan. We could have an entire podcast on sports talk and how, the performance side of it. But I find in anesthesia, one of our jobs, or the way somebody described it to me one time is, I may not know everything about every disease, but I do know all the bad things about every disease and how to account for that in my anesthetic when I'm putting somebody to sleep and getting them through their surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just now that I'm reflecting on what you were telling us, Jason, at the end of a case, when things go well, we'll tell ourselves like, oh man, thank goodness this and this didn't happen. And we were expecting that, right? Instead of just saying, hey, like, look how we accounted for this. And yeah, it didn't happen, but that's because we were prepared, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe like it's the same conversation, but just almost a different frame of mind that maybe gives you a little bit more just a little bit more confidence moving forward.
Well, and here's another thing. It's more truth, because that is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Like, the truth is you didn't get lucky. The truth is you probably set up things and were ready for things that if they did go sideways, you would be ready to respond.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason why.
Yep.
And yet we denounce that. Whereas if it's something bad happened, we'd be the first to take full and complete ownership. Oh, it's all on me. It's my fault. Right. And you go again, right there is the roots of that is just so many days and months and years of the whole process, med school and residency, of thinking that way.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good day? I didn't mess up. Oh, thank God. Right? Like, that's usually, that's the best. Like, that's the Troy Aikman experience again.
Yeah.
And you forget the fact that, wow, there was that moment where, a patient was super scared and I made him feel more comfortable, or, that thing happened. It was a complication we talked about and I was scared, but quickly figured it out. Or, like, on any given day, like I said to you, nobody would be in your field still if you're cruising around at 50% doing things well. I mean, you're doing things at such a high level consistently well. But I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, the one Anne-Marie talked about, but of course we disproportionately focus on the things that could go wrong or did go wrong, because that's where the threat is.
Right.
And the mind is constantly trying to protect me from that threat. Yes, but it gets to a point where it's no longer protecting me. It's obsessing about the threats.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
This has been an incredible conversation. And we've gone over so many different
tons
things.
Of things.
Yeah.
We went from like, what is resiliency, setting up your systems. And then what I really like is that we delved into kind of like the inner dialogue aspect and kind of acknowledge, I think, a lot of things that, for lack of a better word, I think we don't often like talk about openly. So I will say thank you for like sharing all of that and like being so vulnerable, I guess, with us and showing us that vulnerability is okay.
Yeah.
And actually, I would say even necessary.
You know what?
If you want to be good,
and
if you want to have peace, it's absolutely necessary. And who doesn't want to be good? Who doesn't want to have peace? And yet we think the opposite. Don't show weakness. That's not weakness. If you, in showing some vulnerability, get something you need, support, instruction, encouragement, whatever, isn't that the strong move? Isn't that the power move? Whereas to allow my ego to say, I'd sure benefit from something outside of me, but I'd hate to look a certain way. So then you're going to continuously feel nervous, anxious, etc. You have the power to go get what you need. Go get it.
That's very interesting, because then, not to name names, but then I have the example of like, in my mind, what we're told in like medicine or anything performance, like the David Goggins example, that you have to keep pushing through it. But there is a space, and like you kind of have to, in order to grow, to like acknowledge like those feelings, and like, like things happen sometimes, and like also like in your personal life, but it's kind of like what you do with it or what you make of it in the end that, I guess, builds your resiliency?
Yeah, the perspective you bring to it. And I can add to that another story. So a colleague of mine, Dr. Doug Newberg, who has worked with many physicians in the US, he has a similar study he was doing, much like I mentioned earlier, that Malcolm Gladwell, only he was curious to find what is it that, top performers do, particularly medical professionals, when they hit the wall. Something bad happens, or you're just stressed and losing, your sense of purpose, your North Star, etc. And again, he kind of thought it was that idea, like you said, Goggins. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about David Goggins. I think a lot of his philosophy I like, but I don't ascribe to every single thing. But nevertheless, what this colleague of mine learned in this other study was he thought something similar. It must just be, you hit that obstacle, you hit that difficulty, you just knuckle up, you go forward, you dig deeper, you stay earlier, you come, whatever it is. And again, ironically, he found in some of the top performers that the opposite was true. That once they hit that wall, or once they had that difficulty happen, it really kind of rocked them. They stepped out They stepped out of things. They reconnected to the reasons why they do what they do, reconnect to a sense of purpose and meaning and value in the work. And that gave them the energy and perspective to step back in and then face the challenge head on.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that, they necessarily took 2 weeks off to convalesce. That could happen in the evening. That could happen over a lunch hour. That could happen between cases.
Yeah. Yeah. Finding those little moments. Sort of, I think that's one of the many themes of our talk today is just, it doesn't have to be this grandiose thing every time, right?
No.
It can just be little things throughout your week, throughout your day. Yeah.
I always like to use the analogy of a scale. So if on one side of the scale, I have whatever you would consider the toughest day, the toughest outcomes, the stuff that is most difficult about what you do, and I have that weighing things down. Well, if on the other side of that scale, I can find myself, even in a moment where I'm questioning and doubting and worrying and all the rest of that on the toughest days, if I can find reason enough why bearing all of those burdens and pressures is worth it, the balance will shift and I'll be okay. I'll be sustainable. So what are the reasons we're here? Why does this matter to you? And I like to say to people, I don't mean to be facetious, but I don't care what the reasons are. You want to make a difference. It's been your lifelong dream, or you want to buy a Lamborghini. I don't care. What I care is that your reasons matter enough to you that they outweigh the darkest, most difficult days. Because if they do, you're going to be okay. We're not going to eliminate the dark and difficult times. They come with what you do. They don't happen to the bad anesthetists. They just hop in. So when they hop in, the things that come with what I do, can I find reason enough to keep going? If you can, you're going to be okay. But how often do we think of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I always thought that it never really happened, that you kind of like hit a wall, if that's fair to say. But
I think
I'm gathering it's like very normal.
I think that's just normal. That's the thing. We just have to start normalizing these feelings.
Correct.
And
Correct.
Like we already touched on, being vulnerable about it and finding those strategies or those people who you work with that you can be vulnerable with to keep moving forward. Yeah.
One final story about vulnerability. And again, I was working with a surgical group, and we had all the residents, in one room, like years 1 through 5. And we're doing a session. We're talking about this. We're talking about, bouncing back from difficult outcomes and, the shame, the embarrassment, the feelings that someone might go through. And one of the residents who was much more junior was sort of frustrated, like how difficult it can be, and telling themselves it's very hard, to think their way through to a better place, etc. And then they made the comment, they said, we can't all be like so-and-so, and pointed to one of the more senior residents in the room. And this particular person,
that's ballsy,
had come from, military background and was just the epitome of that strong, silent, stoic type. The not, never let them see you sweat. And, I think people question, if he even had emotions, like just that type of persona.
Yeah.
And so they said that. And it was the most powerful thing. That person just slowly lurched forward, in a conference room style boardroom, and made eye contact with that person and said, allow me to destroy the misperception you have of me. He said, yeah, when I'm here, regardless of what's going on, I work hard to project a sense of calm, cool, collected, whatever it might be. He says, you don't see me at home in the fetal position on my bed, crying myself to sleep from time to time. And it was just, nothing could have been said that so effectively raised the bar of what we're allowed to feel in terms of vulnerability. Because the guy that they never thought even had a pulse, basically said, I'm just like you. And it normalized for everybody. It's going to be okay. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's also well said.
Yeah, that's awesome. Jason, this has been, like we said, an incredible talk, and I think our listeners are going to get so much value, so much insight from yourself, and all the anecdotes and ideas that you've shared with us. Before we sign off, was there anything else, in terms of resiliency that we maybe not have touched on that you just wanted to bring up?
I think that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, nothing else that comes to my
Sweet.
mind. If there's some other questions you have, I'm happy to answer them.
I was
Anne-Marie,
going
yeah.
to say, like, where do people find you? Like, I know where to find you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm on, all the social media channels. I admit I don't spend a lot of time on those. I'm just an old person, but I'm
I
on
think you're
Instagram.
just too busy.
Well, yeah, maybe. So I'm on all the, Instagram, Twitter. I think it's Dr. J Bro, dr.jbro on Instagram. I think it's the same on Twitter. I should know that. Certainly, you can reach me at my website, and there's direct lines to email me through that.
Mm-hmm.
My website is www.coachjb.ca. That's probably the best way to get hold of me.
Okay. Awesome.
I love that.
Yeah.
And sometimes I like to ask, I'm kind of always curious, like, where people come from or whatnot. Would you say if there's like a book or something that you read that really left an impact on you, which one would it be?
Gosh, there's so many. Can I say a few?
I'm sure.
I'll say a few that just come to the top of my mind. I would say The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, and not to be confused with The Art of War. That's also a very good book, but different. It talks a lot about the voice of resistance, the inner critic, the things we've been talking about. And I think it presents it in such just an easy, accessible way that makes a lot of sense. I would say Letting Go by David Hawkins is another one that I really like. And I think that's certainly one that I've leaned on more, let's say helping physicians through COVID and all the rest of it, wherein, again, what we wouldn't give to change certain things externally, whether it's workflows or staffing shortages or whatever. But if we're committed to be in the arena and you have little direct influence on those things, then it becomes really important to make sure that I'm not making my situation harder by just constantly reminding me how those things aren't what they should be. One final story. I lied. It speaks to this. So I was involved in a research study the last year and a half out of UCLA. And we were looking at physician burnout. So myself and another person who does what I do, I think we worked with 90 physicians. We split them 50-50. Then each of them got 6 coaching sessions. And just trying to figure out if we could identify, some better perspectives and some better strategies to help them feel and perform ultimately better. And so this is just one anecdote of which, there's hundreds that are like this. There was one person I was working with and, they were struggling. And one of the things they were frustrated with was there's a particular clinic that they run. And I don't know when it was. Let's just say it was Monday mornings from 8 till 12. And this person had been running this clinic for several years, I think 5 or 6. And not one time in the 5 to 6 years that they've been doing this, did the clinic finish before 1 p.m. Supposed to be done at 12, never finishes. Not one time did it finish before 1. So, cue a lot of natural frustration. This is not right. It's not fair. Medicine commands so much from me. I miss my lunch. I get home later to my family. Like all legitimate concerns, no question about it. And so I showed a lot of empathy because I'd be frustrated at that too. And I said, okay, but let's not just stay stuck in emotion. Let's figure out, is there something that we can actually do? So we zoom all the way up. I said, okay, is there anything that you can do directly to ensure that it ends at 12? I mean, is it a matter of scheduling or logistics? Do people just not know or care that it's, infringing upon your personal time, whatever? And she said, you know what? I've thought of that a million different ways. And she said, quite honestly, I don't think he could change it. Number one, the particular work she does, people see her and then they kind of go to another specialist. So, there'd be concerns they would put the other person's schedule out of whack. Number two, just given how busy she was, I mean, those however many patients she squeezes in that extra hour is the difference between them, not being able to book for another 3 or 4 months and coming back sicker or whatever. So long story short, she deemed there's nothing she could do directly to change the source of her frustration. The fact that clinic was bleeding into 1. I said, okay, so then let's zoom out again. I said, so given the fact this is obviously something that's frustrating, is the juice worth the squeeze? Do you need to do this particular clinic? And she looked at me like I was crazy. Like, oh my God, this is the most important part of medicine for me. This is what I do my research on. There's a certain population of people that she felt a lot of satisfaction working with. So no, I would never do this. I said, okay, I'm just asking questions. So let's review where we're at. There's nothing we can do to change directly the source of frustration. And in spite of how frustrating it is, the juice is worth the squeeze. Is that correct? She said, yes, absolutely. I said, okay, for your consideration going forward, what if you allowed yourself that clinic ends at 1 o'clock? And there's this long pause, which may not always be a good thing. And then a smile. And then, okay, I think we're getting the message.
Yeah.
Because she realized in that moment, there is no problem. She's fighting her perspective.
Right.
She's caught up in, but it shouldn't be, but it is, but it shouldn't, but it is. And if I could accept that it is, and I cannot change it, and I wouldn't change being here, that is half the suffering. Now she's making a choice. And so just to dissolve, using that analogy earlier from Peter Crone, the problem rather than solve it. There's no problem to solve.
Mm-hmm.
But if I change my perspective, if I just allowed myself that that's how it's going to be, I reduce some of the suffering.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And just empowers you and gives you the autonomy almost again
Absolutely.
in that situation. Yeah.
And it gives you peace because the frustration that's happening in that moment, when I think about how it shouldn't be that way, isn't related to the situation. It's related to my perspective.
Yeah.
I can change my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Love that.
Yeah, that's incredible. Again,
on that note,
I think that's a great
I
way.
should probably shut up.
Probably a great place to leave it. No, I mean, I think we could keep this going on forever. So, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Brooks.
My
This
pleasure.
was an incredible conversation. And I think we've already touched on the ways that people can reach out to you if they ever needed to. I think, again, just thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
Appreciate the work you're doing here. Anything you can do to support your fellow learners and staff, that's terrific.
Yeah.
Every
Awesome.
time I talk with you, I learn something new and I have more to ponder. I absolutely love it. Absolutely
that's
love
glad.
it. Very
I'm glad to
grateful
hear
for
that.
you
Awesome.
My pleasure.
and for what you do.
Sweet. And thank you again to our listeners who are tuning in again and showing the podcast so much support. And once again, of course, the man behind all the scenes, Dr. Alan Meldrum, who puts this whole thing together for us as well. Thanks again, Alan. And again, once more, thank you, Dr. Brooks. And we'll chat with our listeners again next time.
Yes. And I don't know if it's too late to say this, but happy 2025.
Happy New Year.
At this point. I think we're getting close to the end.
Yeah,
but,
stay warm, everybody.
right. Awesome.
You've been listening to Airway Breathing Conversation, a podcast hosted and presented by the anesthesiology residents at the University of Saskatchewan. Please note that while this podcast is run by healthcare professionals, it is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. We are very thankful to our guests for taking the time to share their wisdom with us this episode, and a very special thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Don't forget to follow us and our associated USask Anesthesia accounts on social media. You can find all our social media links on our Linktree page at linktr.ee/abc_podcast. You can also find the department's social media links on their Linktree page at linktr.ee/usask_anesthesia. We'll see you next episode, but until then, stay calm, take a breath, and always remember your ABCs.